The summer of 2025 was supposed to be a season of recovery for Canadians. After years of uncertainty, people looked forward to reconnecting with friends and family, enjoying the warmth of the sun, and rebuilding a sense of normalcy. Parks were filled with laughter, and city streets buzzed with optimism as festivals returned and communities came together. Instead, a wave of anxiety swept the nation as relations with the United States, Canada's closest ally and largest trading partner, began to unravel. Conversations in cafes and living rooms turned tense, as headlines hinted at a looming crisis. On July 10th, the Trump administration stunned the world by announcing a crippling 35% tariff on all Canadian goods, effective August. The move was sudden, with little warning or explanation, and it sent shockwaves through both governments. The news sent shockwaves through the economy. Markets tumbled, the dollar plunged, and business leaders scrambled for answers. Investors watched in disbelief as the Toronto Stock Exchange suffered its steepest drop in years, and uncertainty rippled through every sector. This wasn't a targeted dispute, it was a sweeping economic assault, threatening every sector from auto plants to fisheries. Factories braced for layoffs, and small towns dependent on cross-border trade feared for their future. The intricate web of cross-border trade built over decades of cooperation was suddenly at risk of unraveling. Trucks lined up at border crossings, and exporters faced the prospect of goods stranded in warehouses. Temporary exemptions vanished and the reality set in. This was no negotiating tactic but a new policy. Government officials scrambled to respond, but options were limited and time was running out. The sense of betrayal was immense as a trusted partnership turned adversarial overnight. Decades of diplomacy and shared sacrifice seemed to evaporate in a single announcement. Canadians were forced to confront their vulnerability and question a friendship they'd always taken for granted. The shock was personal, touching families, workers, and communities across the country. The quiet hum of anxiety became a roar of impending crisis as the nation braced for the uncertain days ahead. When August arrived, the impact of the new tariff was both immediate and devastating, sending shockwaves through every corner of the Canadian economy. The news spread quickly, and a sense of disbelief settled over communities from coast to coast. In Ontario and Quebec, auto plants ground to a halt almost overnight. Assembly lines that once hummed with activity fell silent, and thousands of workers suddenly found themselves without jobs, their livelihoods upended in a matter of days. Job centers overflowed with the newly unemployed, their faces etched with worry as they waited in long lines, uncertain about what the future would hold for themselves and their families. In British Columbia, lumber yards became graveyards for unsold timber. Logging trucks sat idle, and the once bustling industry was brought to a standstill with no buyers in sight. On the prairies, grain elevators and silos overflowed with crops that had nowhere to go. Farmers watched helplessly as their harvests piled up, unable to reach international markets. In Atlantic Canada, fishing boats sat docked and idle, their American market gone overnight. Fishermen mended their nets on shore, uncertain if they would ever set sail again. The entire supply chain froze, from warehouses to transport trucks, leaving small towns and big cities alike in a state of shock and confusion. This was more than a recession. It was a systemic collapse, exposing just how dangerously dependent Canada had become on a single trading partner for its prosperity and stability. For decades, 75% of Canadian exports went south to the United States. Now, with the border effectively closed to trade, there was no plan B, and the consequences were staggering. The nation faced a harsh truth. Its economic sovereignty was far more fragile than anyone had realized. Families, businesses, and government officials all struggled to comprehend the scale of the crisis. As factories closed and goods piled up in warehouses, the country was forced to reckon with its vulnerability and the urgent need for a new direction. The crisis had revealed a critical flaw at the heart of the Canadian economy, one that would demand bold solutions and a reimagining of the nation's future. The tariff crisis hit home for millions of Canadians. Household budgets collapsed, savings vanished, and dreams of homeownership faded. Main streets emptied as small businesses failed, diners, hardware stores, boutiques, all victims of the economic shock. Each closure was a lost dream, a blow to community identity. For workers, mass layoffs meant more than lost income. It was a loss of purpose and pride. The emotional toll was immense, with rising stress and anxiety across the country. Canadians realized their prosperity was not fully their own, but subject to the whims of another nation. The crisis forced a painful conversation about what it meant to be Canadian in an uncertain world. As the crisis deepened, all eyes turned to Ottawa. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government faced mounting anger and demands for action. Diplomatic efforts in Washington failed. The U.S. administration was unmoved. Emergency aid packages offered little relief against the scale of the disaster. Public frustration grew as the government appeared powerless. The real casualty was trust. Canadians no longer saw the U.S. as a reliable partner. Shock and resentment replaced decades of friendship. The perception of the U.S. shifted from ally to adversary. This collapse of trust forced Canadians to reevaluate their most important relationship. The old assumptions were gone, replaced by a harsh new reality. With the U.S. partnership broken, Canada's leaders considered a radical shift. Attention turned to the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and others, as potential new partners. For some, BRICS offered hope, vast markets, and a chance to rebuild. Proponents argued that economic survival required pragmatism and diversification. Critics, however, warned that aligning with authoritarian regimes would compromise Canadian values and security. They feared provoking further U.S. retaliation and alienating traditional allies. The debate was fierce, pitting economic necessity against national principles. Was Canada ready to redefine its identity and alliances? The nation stood at a crossroads, forced to choose between old loyalties and new opportunities. The tariff crisis had made the question unavoidable. By autumn, the shock had faded, replaced by a quiet but unmistakable determination. Across the country, Canadians began to pick themselves up, dust off the uncertainty, and look ahead with a new sense of purpose. The crisis was a wake-up call, ending the era of comfortable dependence. The sudden closures and job losses forced everyone to confront hard truths about the nation's vulnerabilities and the risks of relying too heavily on old partnerships. Canada now faced a pivotal choice: repair ties with the U.S., its longtime ally, or seek new partnerships in a world that was shifting rapidly. The stakes were high, and the decisions made now would shape the country's future for generations. Some argued for patience, hoping to rebuild the North American alliance and restore the trust that had been lost. They believed that history and geography still bound the two nations together. Others insisted the crisis was a point of no return, demanding a bold pivot to new markets and a reimagining of Canada's place in the global economy. They saw opportunity in change and urged the country to embrace it. The debate was about more than trade. It was about national identity, independence, and the kind of country Canadians wanted to become. It was a moment of soul-searching, as citizens weighed tradition against transformation. The likely path would combine both strategies, mending fences with old friends while building new bridges to emerging partners. Canada would need to be nimble, creative, and open to new ideas. The summer of pain forged a tougher Canadian spirit, one that was more realistic, resilient, and ready to face whatever came next. Communities pulled together, finding strength in unity and shared purpose. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Canada's fate was now in its own hands. The choices ahead would not be easy, but the nation was prepared to meet them head-on. The nation stood ready to write its next chapter, drawing on the lessons of the past and the hopes of a new generation. This is a story of resilience, adaptation, and the search for a new place in a rapidly changing world, a story that is only just beginning.